All right, greetings everyone. It's June the 8th, Thursday, and we are marching on. We have a very, very busy weekend of racing across the country and world. There's races in Denmark and Boulder, goodness me, Alcatraz and San Francisco, Eagleman. There's many, many races this weekend, so it should be fun. And most of the races this weekend, maybe not Denmark, but most of the races are going to be very hot. But we march on with our focus on dealing with environment, dealing with the stress of environment in racing is an additional factor. And today we're going to talk about cold. We're going to talk about managing cold and what happens. So Paul and I are going to go back and forth. I will start and talk a little bit about the physiology of what happens under cold so that we understand. And then Paul and I will have a little discussion around how to manage it, how to prepare for it, going through a warm-up, some of the equipment choices and some other factors that you might actually choose to do. So without further ado, Paul is ready to rock and roll. I will start with some of the background before we get to a back and forth decision. So when we approach racing with the cold, I think that as with anything, it is the first thing that we have to do is acknowledge its presence and acknowledge it as another factor, an additional factor of stress on race day. And that doesn't matter, as our discussion the other day when we talked about altitude, you're dealing with heat, you're dealing with wind. If it happens to be that you're dealing with a racing cold, it is another factor to manage. And that's fine. We have to acknowledge it. We can't ignore it. But with a little bit of preparation and with an appropriate mindset and with some of the things that we can execute, it's another factor in race day, but it is one for the most part that we can overcome. And like other conditions, like heat, like altitude, cold, it's no different. It affects certain people a little more or a little less than others. It's a very individual response. The nice thing about cold is that everyone can operate in cold, but it requires some planning. One of the things that's very important, and I think that we should bench around the physiology on this one about what's happening. And we'll do the same when we come into the heat as well. But many people, because cold is just associated with discomfort more than anything, people don't really often look through the lens of it being a performance limiter in the same way as people obviously put the lens of heat being a real performance limiter. And there's much more research and there's much more, or at least open research, information as there is operating in heat than there is in cold races. So we'll talk about what happens under the cold a little bit, because that's going to actually set forth our planning and execution mindset when we do this. So the physiology of when the body cools, and this important nomenclature there, the physiology of when the body cools, so when the blood actually cools, when the muscle cools, is really important from your ability to perform relative to your trained potential in normal conditions. And of course, we have cold water that we can be immersed in, albeit with a wetsuit, but we have cold water, and then we have cold air. And each of those are factors that can actually bring your body temperature down, your muscle temperature, your blood temperature of your blood, etc., etc. And it has a very real impact on your ability to perform relative to levels that maybe you would hope it would be able to in normal conditions. So there are three main elements that are contributing factors to performance decline. There's your cardiorespiratory endurance, and that actually drops under cold conditions. Now, this isn't directly related to air temperature. It's important that I clarify here. This is related to if your body is actually cooling. So when you've been immersed in water for a long period of time and you come out and you are cold and your body temperature has actually dropped, that is the factor. It's not because it's cold outside that you have performance decline. And that's a really important factor to consider when we're talking about this. So when your blood cools, there's a few things that happen. The first thing that happens is that your ability to attain maximal heart rate drops. And so your factor of cardiac output, how much blood you can push out to your body, is an index between how many times your heart beats per minute, and obviously at its max, it's pumping out as much blood as possible, and with something called your stroke volume, which is the volume of blood that is ejecting per heart rate or per heartbeat. So if we have a certain amount of blood ejected with each beat, but we now have a reduced capacity at max heart rate, and this stroke volume, the amount of blood, does not increase, we have a reduction in overall capacity. Now, for an Ironman athlete, that's not a huge performance limiter. It's not a massive issue so far as at your maximal level. In much shorter distance, when you are getting close to there, but it's a little bit, the nice analogy would be, you've just got a little reduction in the size of your engine. So our chassis doesn't change, this is my frame, but the engine is just reduced a little bit when the body cools. And that's one factor just to have in the back of your mind when you think about this. The second factor is when there is an actual drop in your blood temperature. So when your blood temperature drops below about 37 degrees C, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, there's actually an ongoing physiological response where you will have less oxygen delivered to the muscle. That is a limiter. So if you actually get cold enough through cold water immersion or being underdressed in cooling air when you're on the bike, for an example, and your body actually gets cool, your core temperature drops, your blood temperature drops, you have the limiter that you will have less oxygen delivered to the muscle. So not to bore you with physiology, but each molecule of red blood cell has 4 binding sites for oxygen. And what actually happens, and I'm not sure on the specific physiology, but the oxygen molecule binding to a red blood cell, it takes a tighter bond. So it actually ties more tightly to the hemoglobin. It doesn't dissociate as easily. So we don't actually have as an effective of gas diffusion occurring at the muscle site. And we use gas diffusion to deliver oxygen to create energy and offload byproducts to get them out of our system. So that drops. So that becomes actually a performance limiter. So if we actually get cold systemically in our blood, we actually have a real performance limiter that goes down. Also, that in conjunction with that, so at the gas diffusion level, we actually have a reduced flow of that blood volume to muscle with cooler blood. So not only is it less efficient at diffusing gas, we're also delivering less oxygen. And that means that more energy must be created via anaerobic pathways. In other words, we must create energy in the absence of oxygen if we want to maintain that level. So our whole lactate threshold drops, our whole sustainability drops when our blood actually cools. So that's not a good thing from a cardiovascular endurance. Imagine that you've just got a little drop in fitness. That's what's actually occurring when your blood temperature drops. That's number one. The second factor that occurs from a physiological standpoint when your body actually cools in a cool environment is muscular endurance. So when the muscle gets cold, and we've had this feeling before, but when a muscle gets cold, fatigue begins at a lower level of output. This is all again, this is about muscle temperature. It's not about air temperature. Just because it's cold outside doesn't mean that you're going to have performance decline. But if you get cold muscles, there is a drop. Fatigue starts to occur at a lower level. And there's lots of theories of why this might happen. It might be around nerve stimulation and actually firing. It might be in conjunction with that, not being able to recruit as many of the muscles that are theoretically there available. And so the second factor is actually this muscular endurance. It's not just about cardiorespiratory, it's also about muscular. And so we're unable to recruit as many muscle fibers. Wow, cold muscles, cold blood, not such a good thing. And then the final factor is that we have a reduced peak ability to generate power. Much less of a factor for endurance sports, more of a byproduct, we won't go there. So all of that, little 5 minutes of physiology, is that we want to keep our core temperature warm, we want to keep our muscles warm. That's a really important factor. In general, as an individual reaction, very low body fat athletes tend to have greater issues, but it's not always aligned. So there's always the thicker skinned gentleman that's there that has no issue with cold whatsoever. And then we have the very, very lean gentleman or woman that really struggles in the cold. That's the stereotype, that's the norm. But from a physiological standpoint, it can affect both types, both builds. But in conjunction, all athletes, if we're thinking about performance optimization, even if you do have a bit more body fat and you are generally warmer, it's still a factor that we want to keep muscles and blood warm. It's much easier to do that, and this is where we bring Paul in, but it's much easier to do that for the professional athletes and the elite amateur athletes. And the reason it's much easier is because they're able, over the course of the race distance, to generally operate at a higher level of output. And when you operate at a higher level of output, you're doing more work in an absolute term, and you're able to retain a higher heart rate relative to your max, and therefore you're generating more heat. Therefore, it's easier to get warm. So the worst people we look at on race morning, if you're a 6-hour half Ironman athlete, is to look at the 4-hour guys as they're coming out of transition and think, they're not wearing anything. I'm okay because I can do that. Because the truth is that the vast majority of amateur athletes are unable to work, it's just the reality, to work at the level to warm their body up. And I'd say, Paul, bringing you in, that's actually one of the biggest factors that we see for amateur athletes, is the capacity to do the work to get the muscles and the blood actually warm enough when they're operating in a cold environment. You're muted, but would you agree with that?
Sure, and it's doubling down on the psychological thing as well. It's cold, I don't feel well, you shut down the output, and that's just making it worse. The best thing is to work as hard as you can, as long as you can, and produce as much heat as you can. And of course, the first two environments you're going to operate in, the cold, you know, it's about preparation, and we'll get onto that in a moment. And as far as the equipment you choose and how to manage your pre-race and race protocol, the bike where you have a wind chill factor as well as output, and then of course the run, where most people's ability into that tipping point of surviving and doing your best job on the run, when you've got to that place, often regardless of heat or cold, it's a matter of making it to the end the best way that you can. And when it gets cold, that's when the output factor needs serious consideration. And if you're not able to run well and fast at the end and generate that heat, interestingly, even though it's the most benign environment as far as cold, we don't have wind chill or water to take into account, you're at that place where the output is starting to decline, and that's a serious matter as far as generating body heat. So I guess that leads into preparing for those three environments.
It really does. And, you know, our three goals that we want to accomplish when we're approaching this is that we want to maintain as much warmth as possible. So we want to avoid getting cold, which is not a reality. And as Paul said, but we want to do all we can to do that. We also want to prepare to operate in the cold. And then as Paul said, we want to do everything that we can to warm up if you are cold. And that's about going after output. And so we sort of go through step by step and take off and go through and see if we can navigate a little bit of a strategy. So the first thing that I'll talk about is warm up. And I think it's absolutely critical. Most people under warm up, as an interesting phrase there, but most people under warm up globally. They certainly under warm up when it comes to cold conditions. Our first goal, it's not just about getting ready for the swim, it's getting core temperature up. And so you have to have some pre-race running. Firstly, show up to the transition really warm. Show up with your beanie, your gloves, nice warm gear. You don't want to get cold while you're standing around pumping tires up and everything along those lines. Show up prepared. If it's a very chilly morning, and this is where you have to look at race venue. If you go to Hawaii and go and race, it's not going to be that cold at 6 a.m. If you go to Northern California, it could be very, very chilly, even though it might be 80s or 90s later in the day. So understand where you're at, be prepared, be wrapped up warm, and then get the warm up in. If you're someone that needs to generate and hold on to the heat, I don't mind you running with your wetsuit at your waist, then putting your wetsuit on and carrying on to get some stored heat actually in your wetsuit is very important. When it comes to the swim, you have some gear in the swim. The very obvious one is that the flimsy little swim caps that they give you with your race number on is not very effective at keeping heat into the place that we lose heat in the biggest place, which is through the head. So always recommend double caps if it's cold, if not a neoprene. Some people get a little claustrophobic in those. So a latex cap with the Ironman cap on top, a good way to go every single time. For the very slow or more prone to cold athletes, keeping the extremities warm, where you can't do that, you are swimming with your hands and your hands only, I promise. But having booties on, I'm not against for maybe the mid and lower tier athletes if it's very, very cold conditions. The question is, do you get in or out of, do you get in the water before? And everyone has their own personal threshold of water temperature where it is worthwhile getting into the water. It's only worth getting in the water pre-race if you can warm up. So if by getting in the water, you're going to go through hoops to get in the water and swim around and then have to stand outside in cold conditions and get freezing cold, it's probably not a good use or good strategy. If you're able to get into the water, do work, generate heat, get the muscles limber, go right to the start line and go, a really good thing. That temperature threshold is different for different athletes. For me, it was always, okay, if it's under 60 degrees, I'm not probably getting in, but it's very individual. Some athletes need to get in and they need to go through. So getting the warm up in is really important. That takes planning. It means showing up and trying to hit race start with core temperature and muscle, blood flowing through muscles as much as you possibly can. Part one. Then you have race start. You're not going to be likely as prepared to hit a regular race start if you haven't got in the water first. So Paul, couple of tips on race start in very cold environments.
Just the first one is just re-emphasizing that be prepared for the equipment you need to take, and this carries on throughout all three disciplines. In your triathlon goodie box of race preparation stuff that you've tried and tested and so on, make sure you have all the equipment you need for the racing environment that may occur. And that's not the one that occurred last year. That's the whole end of range, from as hot as it can get to as cold as it can get. And with this cold stuff, make sure you have a neoprene cap. Make sure you have some booties. And if it's cold enough that they might allow you to wear them, ask the question at race briefing whether you'll be able to wear them if it stays that cold. So you're not running around going, can I, and looking at everybody else, because the race organizer may put up his hand and go, yeah, you can do that. At Wanaka this last year, they said you could actually wear gloves as well, and they inspected people's hands as they went in to make sure they didn't have webbed fingers, but they allowed you to do that. So make sure you're prepared, ask the question, and know whether you can use the stuff and have the stuff available on race day. But for the race start, it's, as Matt said, it's decide whether it's worth getting in the water. Are you going to cool down or are you going to stay warm? And when you do get in the water, do those environmental things. The thing of the get the head in the water, because that's that initial shock of the brain freeze, and move around a little bit. but know throughout the whole event that one of the things that's going to happen is, if it is going to be cold, it's going to be cold for everybody, and you're going to go and race whether it's cold or not. You get to choose whether you're going to race well in the cold or not race well in the cold. Either way, it's still going to be cold. So get the mindset right. It's a condition, it's an environmental factor that you're going to have to deal with. And if you deal with it well, you're going to have a head start over a whole bunch of people who, A, haven't prepared well, and B, shut down because they're convinced they're going to have a bad day because it's cold.
It's perfect. When the gun goes off, and this is easier to execute with the new rolling starts that occur, you want your starting effort in a race to be relative to your warm-up. So if you've had very limited warm-up, you're going to have to be more conservative, period. It's just a factor. You want to be calm. You want to avoid the panic reaction. There's nothing worse than the claustrophobia and hyperventilation that occurs with going too hard relative to warm-up. And the cost of doing that is great. And so have your effort relative to your warm-up protocol. Look after the basics. Look after the things you can control. Swimming in a straight line and navigating the course as well as you can. And then progressively build your effort up as you go. The vast majority of swims, unless you're bordering on being out of the safe zone, the vast majority of swims, the water temperature will be warm enough for most swimmers to raise their core temperature. That's an opportunity. So the people that struggle, the people that are way on the back end, that just simply can't swim hard enough to raise core temperature, those are the people that struggle. For the main body of athletes, you have to, as a quote from Paul, cold is a state of mind. I think it's important to embrace that. Go out calm, but then build it and say, the one way that I can offset being cold is to swim to my level. And if you commit to that, over time, you're going to get more and more comfortable with it. So look after the basics and execute. Now we hit transition one. Again, be prepared, be calm. We talked about planning before. We realize that when you are cold, when the head is cold, the one thing that occurs, and in fact, it occurs in a medical sense as well, is people start to draw towards apathy and lack of focus. That's one of the physiological factors of the body and system getting cold. So the more that you can have your transition protocol be intuitive and habitual, the better place that you're going to be in. So understand where you always and how you always set up your gear, and try and minimize the stuff that you have to do with your fingers. So if you are thinking of swimming without a bike jersey on or without a triathlon jersey on and putting it on in transition, be prepared that that is going to be a very hard thing to do with very cold fingers. So it's typically better to actually have everything that you're going to have on and layer on top of it. Very simple stuff. Minimize stuff to do with fingers. Toe caps on your neoprene toe caps, as untrendy as they are, but on the end of your shoes, we want to keep your feet or get your feet warm as quickly as we can. So something that can be sitting on your shoes that doesn't impede you getting your bike, your shoes into your clips, etc. Really important. Using Mylar blankets, if it's going to be chilly, a very easy thing that you can dispose of, that you can just go to Sports Basement or Sports Authority and cut some of the metallic marathon type blankets, cut them into squares, underneath, over the top of the quads, under the arms if necessary, certainly the chest panel where you're going to be taking the bulk of the wind, all of that side of stuff, very good to have, swim with it underneath. Don't put it on in transition. Underneath your jersey, you've got a shield of wind block. It's going to help you generate to it. If you're getting warm as you go through the bike ride, you just strip it at an aid station. Very, very simple. Extremities, gloves if needed, arm warmers, vest, all stuff that is not the trendiest and your favorite, but the stuff that you can dispose of, if necessary, is the best way to go. And getting onto the bike, and the mission is as effectively and as efficiently as you can, without wasting time, but knowing who you are and how you're affected, ensuring that you know, okay, I'm a pro athlete that's going to be able to generate a lot of heat or towards that trend, you probably need less. I'm a 3-hour plus half Ironman bike rider. You're probably not generating as much heat or near as much heat as that. I might need a little bit more. And it's a worthy use of 2 to 3 minutes as a percentage of my overall time to get myself warm. Anything else on the bike, Paul? It's your domain. Anything else on the bike, at least on the start of the bike, not just right, and then we'll go into maybe riding into it. And why don't you transition into that?
There's the preparation thing comes down to it. Make sure you've got, tried and tested all the stuff that you might use on the day. And as much as, you might be, Duncan's going to need to put a pair of long johns in to wear under his kilt on a cold day. But it's, he'll have tested them. But with all seriousness, the toe caps, the toe warmers, or even a full bootie that you can put on you can have it if you're a shoes on the bike guy and you can't get your booties on with the shoes on the bike, then be the guy who gets into your shoes with your booties on. Test that stuff out. Know that if it's cold enough for booties, it's generally, and cold enough for gloves, it's cold enough to cover your knees and those working muscles. So don't be afraid of putting on some knee warmers if it's going to be cold all day. It fascinates me to see people riding around this town at the moment with their thermal gloves, their thermal jacket, their beanie, their toe covers, and their knees in the breeze. So if it's cold enough for gloves and toe covers, it's generally cold enough to cover your knees. So be prepared to do that and take the time. It'll make a big difference to your day. And if it does get so warm, don't have your Rafa knee warmers in your race bag, because you're going to be giving away $120 when you stop to take them off and dispose of them at an aid station. Have some that work, that do the job, that you're prepared to lose later in the day if it does warm up. As Matt said, there's the option of using sections of Mylar blanket and then you can just take them out and throw them at an aid station. But the one thing people think of, cover my fingers, cover my toes, those are the extremities. It's very important if you can keep your fingers warm, that you can shift gears and do all the other functions of hydrating and eating and so on the bike, which still need attending to on a cold day. And if your hands are cold and you don't have that function and then you can't adequately fuel, that will also catch up on you later in the day. The other thing is, as Matt said, in the swim, you lose a vast amount of air or heat through your head. And on the bike, we have this marvelous piece of equipment called a helmet, where they focus on ventilation and so on. If it's a really cold day, and you may consider taping up the vents in your helmet or wearing a little skull cap underneath your helmet to keep the cold air from stripping all that heat away through your head. So that's just a few equipment things you want to think about. You have them in your transition bag, or in your box by your bike if it's one of those setups, and you have the option of using it. As Matt said, don't look at what the pros have left the transition area with. They will be generating a whole bunch more watts and a whole bunch more heat. It's what you need. And trust me, you're far better off to go err on the side of, I'm going to get warm and then take a minute to get rid of it, than be cold for 3 hours plus. It'll make your day a much better place to be.
Much faster, and also much more filled with pleasure. I'll just remute you, Paul, and get feedback for some reason. The one other thing I think that to say on the bike that's really important, because we spend so much time talking about terrain management, I think there is an awareness, and as I said before, cold creates apathy, lack of focus, and factors like that. A great example is a recent race at Santa Rosa 70.3, a chilly morning, chilly water, and the first thing the athletes had is a screaming descent for a couple of miles. The next thing after that was one of the main feature climbs of the day. That reeks of opportunity. We talk about generating heat. you have to have an awareness, a reality, an understanding, and appreciation that you are going to get to the bottom of that climb without able to generate much heat because you're descending. So don't let it be a surprise when you see that on the race course plan and you go and execute it on the day, that when you get to the bottom of the descent, you are cold. It's actually probably the coldest you will be on the whole of the day. But you see, when I went to that race, I stood just around the corner and you saw the body language. And many people were defeated. It's cold. I'm not enjoying it. This is going to be a long day. The people that were wise, that showed body language, at least from me reading body language, the people that turn around and saw a nice steady grade for the next mile or two, an opportunity to develop work, ride your way into it, and generate heat. And that's the one way that you can actually raise core temperature. Yes, try and avoid it as much as possible, but then understand that we're going to generate heat by doing work. And so, almost to be darned with race pacing, if you can get the body temperature up, that's the place. State of mind thing comes back. If you are defeated by the reality of cold, you're never going to get there, because if you climb the hill with apathy, you won't generate heat and you will remain cold. If you go with vigor, even though it's uncomfortable, even though you are cold, even though your focus is low, you have a fighting chance of getting back up to regular operational level, which is really important. And so use the terrain to develop warmth as much as you possibly can. That just sits in parallel with what Paul and I talked about with preparation and equipment choices as we go through. As we talked about before, the challenge is for the lower level athlete. The challenge is to get the effort up enough to actually raise temperature of muscle, temperature of blood. And so, of course, that planning and equipment becomes amplified in importance. So as we go through, that's the other component. The one final thing I was saying, operating in the heat, and then handing it off to Paul to wrap this up. But Paul mentioned nutrition and hydration. When it is very cold, your body doesn't get any signals of hunger, or much lower signals of hunger. They're suppressed in the same way as thirst as well. You won't need as much hydration from a rehydration standpoint. You do need hydration to help transport the calories that you're consuming. But when you're cold and your focus drops, the natural tendency is to forget to eat and forget to drink. And that will come and bite you later in the day, and certainly later in the day if it is actually going to heat up and get hotter in the day, which many of the races do. But don't forget to stick to your protocol, hydration, fueling, even though you're not getting the signals. And that's where using things like little buzzers or timers or reminders, whatever the cue is for you to help you stay on task, it's really important. Paulie, anything else that we missed on cold weather operating?
There's other things on the bike, as Matt said. Use the opportunity of the terrain to generate heat, but also use the opportunity of your different riding tools to generate heat. Sometimes a little bit more muscle tension is good for generating heat within that muscle, as opposed to the high cadence pedaling option. I'm not saying grind a big gear every time it's cold, but don't be afraid to actually put a bit of pressure on the pedals to generate some heat. And if there is the opportunity to get out of the saddle and move other parts of the body a little bit, and even though we're trying to be as quiet as possible with our interactions with the bike when we're standing, just standing up and having the bike moving a little bit, getting a little bit of blood moving, is often a good way of generating a little bit of heat. So you do everything you can. You're going to make the best of the opportunity. It's cold. I'm going to race as well as I can. And if you're well prepared, you have an advantage over those people who are not. I guess we've got to run now.
Then we've got to run. Duncan, we can wrap all of that up, all of that discussion up into one thing, which is no excuses. It's all just about a state of mind and preparation. I think that's what we talked about. The one final thing I will say on the cold, just on the run, as this is a mechanical fatigue sport for many athletes, and especially as you go into some of the races where they dip into the evening hours, where we've got Ironman athletes, And many athletes have their training and say, I don't get cold in running. I go out and I do my training runs and I don't get cold. And you can almost run in any conditions. And it's not because of, as Paul said earlier, the lack of wind on you, the lack of water around you. It's not uncommon to see regular people that are running with pretty minimal outfit on, sometimes just a short sleeve or maybe just a little long sleeve, but it's very rare that you really have to run in very prepared apparel unless you're out in the snow. And it's different in Ironman racing. The difference in Ironman racing is by the time you get off the bike, especially again for lower end athletes, you start to experience really mechanical fatigue, muscular fatigue, and that is your limiter. And it's not rare at all for an athlete's heart rate on the run to be lower in an Ironman than it is on the bike. And that's different than any other training session you would typically do, where we tend to experience heartbeats that are about 7 to 10 beats per minute higher on the run because you're doing more work and it's weight bearing. You've got more muscular work because the arms get active and it's weight bearing. But because of the limiting factor of mechanical fatigue, many people just simply cannot get the workload up. And therefore, even though you're not wrapped in water, even though you don't have air cooling on you generally, you are actually more susceptible to cold. You can't get the heat up. And so if you're doing a race like Ironman Arizona, which may be warm in the day, but might get desert cooling in the evening, it's worth being prepared. And you might actually need to be very ready to have a jacket or something to keep you warm on the run. Again, very different from the pros, not susceptible because they're able to generate the heat. Paul, anything on that?
Just a carryover factor from the bike. If you haven't been mindful of maybe wearing some merino socks or covering your feet, there are races where people have run the first 10 or miles or so of the race without proper feeling in their feet because they're so cold from the bike ride. So know that if you're somebody who's not running quickly, or even someone who is running quickly, that is not going to lead to your best running form if you've got numb feet and can't feel the sensation of how they strike the ground and how they leave the ground. So yeah, a little bit of preparation in that regard as well, that it's not just about keeping your feet warm on the bike. It may be a factor when you get off and start running.
Super. Well, we talked for 40 minutes on that. That became a pretty big subject. So any questions of the day around the running in the cold or racing in the cold?
So a question about warming up. So I got Alcatraz this weekend.
Yep.
And the opportunities for warm-ups are limited. My plan is try to get a 10-minute run in before I get on the boat. And then I'm going to bring stretch cords to do some kind of reps on stretch cords. And then kind of standing mobility stuff, dynamic stretching as much as I can in my one little vertical slice of boat. Any other thoughts, ideas?
Welcome to Alcatraz.
Yeah.
That is the factor. It's the factor for everyone. 0 warm-up. The only way that you could get a warm-up, Tim, is to swim out to the boat and chase it out there, but I probably wouldn't.
And then I missed someone came into my office while you were talking. So then the strategy, no warm-up, is to start the swim out a little bit slower and consider the first part of the swim to be the warm-up?
Yeah, the difference in Alcatraz is you have a boat, you have a door that you're going to jump off, and when you're in the air, the next person is jumping. So for Alcatraz, what I typically tell people to do is hit the water and swim for 20 or 30 seconds and then stop or swim with your head up if you're there. But really, if you're sort of a chance of getting panicked, you want to hit and get away quickly. And then you want to set your bearing. There's no buoys in Alcatraz. So it's a 1.5 mile swim that can have the personality of 2 miles, the personality of a mile. It's going to be a faster swim this weekend. Stop, reset. Sighting is important. Sight where you stop. Make sure you know where you're swimming, and then hit the ground running. So that's your opportunity to calm down. Hit the water and swim, and then calm down. And whether it's breaststroke or swimming with your head up with good sighting, but just make sure that you then go through the easier stuff and build into the swim.
Okay, sounds good.
Good swim. Let's go to Aberdeen because they've got an election today.
Yeah, I need to get on a boat just after this, but yeah, I guess the question's really around whether it's possible to adapt for cold. So like certainly in the swim, if you can, most of my open water venues here are still pretty cold. Whether just swimming in open water, cold open water, will then help adapt, and also then whether it's worth swimming long in cold open water, or whether that's sort of more damaging longer term for the rest of the training and stuff like that. So if an hour swim in, I don't know, 55 Fahrenheit, something like that, it's probably worth it or not.
Some of that, so the adaptation, I think most of the adaptation is the adaptation over a long period for people that are doing things like the channel swim is actually retention of fat, which is overall not a great adaptation you want to go for. From a physiological standpoint, I think it's mostly familiarity and understanding how to operate. How long you swim is relative to level and how you can operate, how hard you can operate. So someone that is a weaker swimmer swimming 45 minutes in cold water without able to generate enough heat, that might be really negatively impactful, versus if myself as a swimmer, a previous real swimmer, if I was fit, went and swam 45 minutes, I could work hard enough to get my temperature up and it'd be minimal, because it's all about cold. I will say that heat exposure is very uncomfortable. So running it's very uncomfortable, but it doesn't have a huge, unless you have moving towards heat exhaustion, that type of thing, which does have longer term effects. The thing that knocks the wind out of people's sails is when they get very cold. So doing a swim and getting cold is not great. It really is a stressful thing. People tend to feel pretty awful. Going on a bike ride, get caught in a rain shower without being properly equipped and getting freezing cold and riding for 2 hours, you can expect multiple days when you're going to feel pretty flat in training. And so the answer is it effective and do it? I'd much rather you try and do higher intensity intervals and make it really high value and get out of it without getting really cold. The headline news is there's no benefit to exposing yourself to cold, to get cold, having a crappy session and thinking that that's going to get you better equipped. It might toughen you up a little bit, but there's not a physiological benefit. Good stuff. Geneviève.
Good day, Matt. No question today. I just enjoyed the topic on the cold, not liking to be cold myself. So.
Yeah, good stuff. I'm glad it was helpful.
Yeah,
Jordan.
thank you.
I didn't really have anything. I know I wanted to chat with you and Paul about the bike stuff that we've talked about, but nothing for this weekend, though. There is a strong rumor, and I actually just got an email that because of the weird currents they've been experiencing in the bay, the swim course may be rerouted, which I don't know really what that means, but people need to make sure they attend the athlete meetings this weekend because there could be changes.
Wow. I wonder how you reroute that.
I know, that's like, do you just stop them and like, it's supposed to be like a flood tide, so you're like being pushed out, but there's been some really weird currents. Rich swam out there with Sarah the other week, and they only lasted about 1,000 meters because it was so crazy.
Wow. Well, it will be interesting. I enjoy going to watch my unique. I will say something to the global audience about Alcatraz. There's two things. Firstly, if you ever get a chance to do it, it's a wonderful race. My favorite thing about the race is you go as hard as you can on the swim, as hard as you can on the bike, and as hard as you can on the run, and you have no barometer of how you've done. It's such a course of variability. The swim course is random on currents. The bike course is so up and down that you certainly can't draw any conclusions around average power or anything like that, and it's only 18 miles. And the run course is half on trail and sand. So it is a race that you go and do for the love of the sport and the love of the challenge, but it is a very, very special experience if you ever go and do it. So,
yeah. From a personal perspective, I've done that swim in 55 minutes and I've done it in 28 minutes. That's how variable it can be.
That sums it up. I remember coming out of the water 2 years in a row. with the same two guys, Simon Lesson and Craig Walton, if you remember those guys. And
Dating yourself.
one year we came out as a threesome in 33 minutes at the head of the group, and the next year, or vice versa, it was 22 minutes. So there's a big swing in what can happen there. So good stuff.
Don't judge your swim time.
We're good to go. I think we've got freedom, Paulie. All right, good session, guys. Best of luck to everyone racing this weekend. I hope it goes really well. And go and vote, Duncan. You're in the Tory stronghold up there of Aberdeen. All right, guys. Take care.
Thank you.